It's not often that a standard legal set will have vintage playables in it, but Aetherdrift might be the exception. I'm Justin, I'm actually level 1, and this is Voice of Vintage. Welcome back, Vintage gamers, to a new set preview. I don't always do new set previews for Vintage because typically standard legal sets don't have a lot of Vintage playables in them. However, Aetherdrift has at least 2 cards that have caught my eye, one being a very powerful Mishra's Workshop playable, and the other being a Lotus recursion removal spell. Both of these, I think, are going to make at least some amount of splash in the Vintage format. And then I have a pile of other notable honorable mentions that I either need to dispel rumors about or are piquing my interest as possible videos in the future. So, Aetherdrift has an uncommon that is likely to be the most played card from the new set in Vintage, and that is Momentum Breaker. Momentum Breaker is a 1 in a black enchantment with Starcher Engines. Starcher Engine is not going to be a super relevant part of the text here in Vintage, but it is not irrelevant. Basically, every turn in which you hit your opponent where they lose life, you will get max speed up to a max speed of 4. That is relevant for the second part of this enchantment, where you can pay 2 and sack the enchantment and gain life equal to speed. If you are making 4 life every time that you sacrifice this, that is not a small amount and could definitely swing matchups. However, the main point of this enchantment in Vintage is going to be, when this enchantment enters, each opponent sacrifices a creature or vehicle of their choice, and each opponent who can't discards a card. The main thing here is a sack a creature effect on an enchantment that is playable inside of the Lotus blue-black control deck or Esper control deck that has the ability to sacrifice itself and be replayed from the yard with Lotus. So, right now, the blue-black Lotus deck has some problems in its chosen removal suite. Now, it could always change its removal suite, but for the stock blue-black lists, they can't seem to deal with large non-white creatures at the moment. So, something like a Murktide Regent out of Doomsday will actually have no viable answers inside of the current stock shells of blue-black. This card will be a nice catch-all answer that can deal with problematic permanents that don't get hit by Fatal Push for the blue-black deck, and also give you some incremental life gain in different blue-black Esper Lotus mirrors. The fact that this is not a dead card when the opponent has no creatures is a very significant upside, where the opponent has to discard a card if they have no creatures to sacrifice, and being able to loop this and do discard is also a pretty reasonable thing. So, this enchantment here goes in one of the best decks in the format and helps shore up some of the current builds of that deck's weakness. I think it is a shoo-in as the #1 card in Aetherdrift for Vintage. While Momentum Breaker has an easy slot in an existing deck, the second most likely card to be played in Vintage from Aetherdrift would probably be building a home for itself. The Marketback Walker is a card that looks specifically geared to enter Vintage with a bang. This XX artifact creature construct entering with X+1/+1 counters has the Walking Ballista ability to add counters to it for 4 mana, and it has, whenever this creature dies, draw a card for each 1/1 counter on it. This card plays extremely well inside of a Mishra's Workshop shell, which is powering out fast artifacts, and particular different kinds of combo-oriented shells that I've played in the past. Things like Kark Clan Ironworks would definitely love to have this kind of modular costing card that is also going to be drawing cards. As XX, this is a 0 cost, so you can return it by sacrificing your 1 and 2 and 3 drops. It's very nice to have a 0 cost that is going to draw you cards. You typically don't really play those inside of KCI. So instead of getting back a Mox, if you have a ton of mana already, being able to get back, a Marketback Walker, which is going to draw you cards and will let you use your surplus of mana to draw additional cards, is going to be very, very powerful. KCI has never been a Vintage staple deck, but it's always been more of a fun deck that I like to play. It has the power level to be viable in Vintage, but suffers very heavily from the fact that people are usually geared to beat Coveted Jewel combo with Null Rods and Collector Roofs. And then it doesn't have blue or green, which will give ways to battle combo decks. So you typically end up being a very fragile glass cannon style deck. However, this card is an extreme upgrade for that deck. It also pairs very well with Arcbound Ravager, which is another card that sometimes sees play in this style deck. Arcbound Ravager can put extra counters on it. It can eat it with its ability to, make you cash in the draw cards right away. The fact that you play KCI and Arcbound Ravager sometimes in the same exact shell means that this card is just a perfect fit for that style of deck. Would this card see play in a traditional aggro-oriented sphere resistance Arcbound Ravager workshop deck? Maybe. It's certainly worth a shot. I would definitely recommend trying it. It's as a scaling threat that lets you have a mana sink and plays again well with cards that are already going to be existing inside of your shell. I think this card has a lot of potential inside of various Mud Mishra's Workshop decks, and I would be very surprised if this card doesn't see at least some results from curious deck builders as the format progresses. Now, I would guess that over time, the amount of play that this card receives probably diminishes and comes close to zero. And the reason for that is not because that this card is underpowered or bad, but more that the decks it's going to be played in don't really line up into the current state of Vintage. Everyone has null rods and collector oofs and ways to deal with this style of deck, and I would be very surprised if a Marketback Walker Shops deck became a mainstay, at least in the current format. It's worth noting that Vintage is going to change over time. New cards will get added. So maybe some cards get restricted. Maybe some cards get unrestricted. And that could always change. So these cards that are meeting the criteria in power level, but might not be meeting the metagame spot for them, are always cards to keep in the back of your mind as you're deck building. If our first two cards are considered the most likely cards to be played in Vintage from Aetherdrift, our next two cards are going to be plausible cards that could see play depending on some factors. First, we've got Repurposing Bay, a blue artifact that has the ability to sack another artifact and go one up the chain in terms of mana value, putting that card directly onto the battlefield, activating only as a sorcery. This is similar to a card that has already seen play in Vintage, Oswald Fiddlebender, a card I actually registered at the last Eternal Weekend. The differences between this and Oswald Fiddlebender are, well, the Fiddlebender can get killed by removal, and this card is blue, so it pitches to Force of Will and goes nicely inside of those big blue decks. But the big thing that I'm looking at here is one of Oswald's most used abilities is to sacrifice a Moxen, getting a portable hole, and removing a Null Rod or Collector Oof from the battlefield. This card will not be able to do that because it is an artifact and it is affected by Null Rod and Collector Oof, which is my big concern. This card has a powerful text on it. It is it's very much a Vintage level card. It's going to do Vintage things, mostly going to get Time Vault, Key, that kind of thing. Even maybe in a bigger deck, you're changing your a 3-drop into a 1-ring. You're changing a 1-ring or a relic into a 5-drop. Maybe you're changing a 5-drop into a Bolus's Citadel. There's a lot of very powerful things you can do with this sort of Birthing Pod-esque effect. The biggest problem for me is I just don't see a home right away. So this card is 3 mana, so it cannot be played inside of Lurrus. So it doesn't have that nice synergy with Lurrus where you're sacking things and bringing them back. So it has to be played in a big blue Tinker deck. And I think it will be totally fine in a big blue Tinker deck, giving you some additional redundancy, helping you find Vault Key. It might make your deck a little wonky in terms of what cards you're going to register, because you want to be able to go up the chain. This deck might end up being a Workshop deck, as its casting cost you can cast off of Workshop, though you can't activate its ability off of Workshop. I just don't see an immediate home for it, and that's because these Tinker decks are currently out of the meta. Tinker Bolas Citadel is a very powerful combination, and the decks that played Tinker Bolas Citadel were very powerful and very common for many years before Lurrus really took over the format. And this could be a card that doesn't really see play until maybe the cat is gone. That's a totally different discussion. Probably not a very good idea is my my first reaction to something that's like that. But again, this is similar to the idea of Marketback Walker and how it maybe doesn't see play immediately because of metagame restrictions, but it could be a force to be reckoned with further down the line. Again, my biggest worry is this effect has seen play in Oswald, but one of the biggest reasons Oswald works is, one, because you have Luris with it to do regrow things, and two, because it's going to be able to fetch that portable hole and turn off null rod effects. So those are my concerns. That being said, this is a very powerful effect. This can do very powerful things because the artifacts of Vintage are extremely strong. Time Vault Key being the big main thing that this card is going to be searching for. So keep an eye on Repurposing Bay. I'm definitely going to do a video with some kind of Tinker Repurposing Bay deck, and I think I'll have a lot of fun playing it. Our last card in the plausible category is another Luris recurring engine here. We've got the Grim Bauble. Now, this likely Popper All-Star is an artifact. For 1 black mana, ETBs, a creature gets -2/-2 that an opponent controls until end of turn, and then you have the ability to later sacrifice this for 2 black and tap and surveil 2, putting cards either on the top of your library or in the graveyard. Again, this is going to be a removal spell that is going to be recurable with Luris. However, I don't think this is a very Luris control style card, and the reason is -2/-2 is not super high. -2/-2 is quite reasonable for like a Luris Mirror, but this won't always kill Frog. This will kill Bowmaster and Luris, but cards like Deadweight already exist previously. Maybe the ability to be like a later cracking for a Surveil, fueling your Luris makes this card a little bit better than Deadweight, or maybe Deadweight being, going to the graveyard right after killing a thing and being able to recur right away is more powerful. Either way, Deadweight doesn't really see play in current Luris builds, especially with the Luris nerf to companions. Deadweight was a very big portion of the metagame when Luris was free, but now that Luris costs 3, doesn't really work super well. Another big problem with -2/-2 is it doesn't kill most of the creatures in Mono White Initiative, the other creature-based deck of the format. So the fact that this doesn't kill a lot of the creatures in the format makes me think that this won't see as much play. One thing that I didn't really talk about inside of the first Momentum Breaker, but the one thing that this Grim Bauble and Momentum Breaker both do is sit and play and then can get cracked later. This is somewhat of a upside and somewhat of a downside, but there actually is a big upside if you are not playing Luris Control, but you are playing Luris Combo. Luris-based Breach or PO decks might find this card more interesting for them, or Momentum Breaker for that matter, because both of these cards will stay in play right away, where a card like Deadweight might kill something and go straight to the yard. A Bauble staying in play means it can be picked up with Paradoxical Outcome. Being able to pick up with Paradoxical Outcome is a huge upside. It gives you a lot of versatility, especially when you're playing a PO deck with Luris, because then you can either sacrifice this to fuel your Luris and fuel your Surveil, or use this to keep in play to fuel Metalcraft on Mox Opal or be picked up with PO. I'm not sure that this sees a ton of play in Luris PO, but Luris PO is always looking for additional 0 and 1 mana artifacts to make sure that the count for Metalcraft on Mox Opal and PO is high enough. This card is similar to Portable Hole, that it will answer a Collector Roof. However, it is different than Portable Hole because it will not answer a Null Rod. Which makes me think that this card doesn't seem like it will see play in the main of a Luris PO deck, but I could totally see this coming in and out of the board if Luris PO was looking to have extra tools to beat Luris Control. Being able to kill a Bowmaster, being able to kill a Luris, those do sound like reasonable things. Again, Portable Hole does seem like a more powerful all-around answer for the Luris PO deck, and those decks are almost always in white, so it does, feel like it's kind of working in the same space as a more powerful answer. But this does, of course, have upsides. Being able to be sacrificed is something that Portable Hole can't do. So there's some things to think about here. I would not be surprised if some decks are trying out Grim Bauble and specifically Luris, and very much specifically Luris PO combo. After Grim Bauble, we start moving to our more honorable mentions category. These cards are going to vary between things I'd like to dispel rumors about, or just be cards that I want to hint towards a future video. The first one, we've got a Voyage Home. This is a card I've actually seen a Reddit thread on calling for its restriction in the future. From my take, I don't think this card will see very much, if any, play. Very similar to the existing Thoughtcast, which is easier to cast and doesn't see play as it is. The requirement for affinity for artifacts it's weird because while the vintage deck does have more artifacts, a lot of the time these are Moxen and are making mana on their own. Obviously, affinity is better than something like the Kappa Cannoneer, which requires tapping. But having to require blue and white mana is a significant cost in comparison to something like Thoughtcast or Thought Monitor, which are just blue. Traditionally, decks that are going for affinity for artifacts are going to be Seat of the Synod, sometimes Workshop decks, and they require a lot of all-in on artifacts. Like Seat of the Synod is the big major example of a card that you typically need to play a Thoughtcast deck. That being said, some PO decks in the past have chosen to play Thoughtcast. I've always found that to be extremely clunky without having access to those artifact lands. Getting to draw an extra card in game 3 life is a very high upside, but I'm almost certain that the white mana here is an extreme downside, and I don't expect this card to see vintage play in a huge amount. I do think it's very much a brewable card, a playable card, as it's blue, so it's pitching to force. So if you can make a blue-white artifact-based deck work, then this card could be useful inside of that shell. White is definitely a reasonable thing to strive for, because white will give you additional ways to remove a Null Rod, which is one of these decks' huge weaknesses, Collector Roof, stuff like that. So while I would like to probably curb the idea that this is a restriction-worthy card in Vintage, I do think I'd like to encourage the idea of brewing inside of a blue-white affinity-based space, because I think there are a lot of powerful cards and interactions amongst those colors and artifact-based decks in particular. We've got the Radiant Lotus. This is going to be your EDH $70 card coming out of the set. I don't even know if this card is relatively good in EDH, and I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think this card is good in Vintage right now. Why do I say right now? So one of my problems with this card is you are paying 6 mana, and you are sacrificing artifacts to make more mana. Once you have 6 mana, you don't usually have to sacrifice artifacts to make more mana. That being said, one thing this card does is it makes mana of a chosen color. So you can turn Mishra's Workshop mana, basically you use your Workshop turn 1, Workshop turn 2, play this, and then you can actually make some mana to play a big, blue spell, very likely, or, any color, really. So if you had a deck that is using Mishra's Workshop as your main source of mana, and you somehow needed to become a Mishra's Workshop deck that is comboing with not artifacts, and you need colored mana, then this card could have some uses. The thing that immediately came to my mind is that Mind's Desire is a card that is restricted in Vintage, and Mind's Desire is a card that has been recently unrestricted in Legacy to very little effect on the format, and is a card people have sometimes called for the unrestriction of in Vintage. Now, in my most recent unrestriction video, I said I think Mind's Desire is a little too risky in Vintage because of how good Moxen and Lotus and all the fast mana are. That being said, one of the counter arguments to a Mind's Desire unrestriction is that making blue-blue fast is very hard. It is not always easy to make blue-blue. You have to go through some hoops. Maybe you have to do chrome moxes and opals and that kind of thing. This could theoretically fit in a mono-blue Workshop combo deck like Jewel for Desire, where you are going to be able to use your Workshop mana to play this out and then sacrifice all of the things you used along the way to get to 6. Say you go Workshop, Monolith, Mox, or something. Turn all of those things that you use to cast this into additional mana and play a lethal Mind's Desire hitting other Mind's Desires. Obviously, that's not a play you can make right now in Vintage, but it's a play you could make in a theoretical future Vintage, especially with the idea that WotC is looking to possibly unrestrict more cards moving forward in Eternal formats. So yeah, I don't expect us to see any play in Vintage right now, but there's always a possibility. The Last Ride. This is an artifact version of Death's Shadow. This card I don't really see a home. There aren't really Death Shadow decks in Vintage right now. Death's Shadow, probably. That being said, the fact that this has a ability on it to just pay 3 mana and draw a card while still being a threat on its own is something that's intriguing. I think this card has a brewing potential. It could be worthwhile to try to include inside of some kind of Death Shadow deck. Giving the Death Shadow deck redundancy in its 1-drops is definitely an interesting upside. And it is, of course, a Lurisable card. The problem with Luris and Death Shadow is, although they play pretty well together, not the lifelinking part, but the fact that they can be recurred by the Luris, one of the main enablers for Death Shadow is Street Wraith, which you cannot use with Luris. So it's kind of a hard to balance problem where you're trying to lose enough life to play, and have these Death Shadows and Last Rides be effective, but also you can't use your most effective enabler. So just a thing to think about. I know some people have been excited about this card. I don't really see it in Vintage, but I am, of course, always encouraging the brewing. And then finally, we have the Loot Pathfinder. This is a 5-mana double striking vigilance 2/4 with 3 exhaust abilities. Exhaust ability is one that you can only ever activate once. You can turn a green into 3 mana of any one color, use a blue and draw 3 cards, and use a red and deal 3 damage to any target. I've heard a lot of different and creative ways to use this card. I think one of the ones that excites me the most is maybe giving creatures these abilities with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. That would be the one that immediately jumped out at me as one of the most exciting things. And I think this card is probably bad, and the decks that it's going to be played in are probably bad, but they're going to be very fun, and that is a good enough reason for me to make a Vintage video with this one. So I want to turn some things into loot the Pathfinders and start drawing 3 cards, lightning bolting, ancestraling. Man, it just sounds like a good time. So I want you to expect a Vintage video, and if I don't make one, you can yell at me and point to this video saying, Justin, you were going to make a Loot the Pathfinder deck, and I will. I guarantee it. Oh, I do have more. Look at that. Yeah, we're leaving it in. Leave it in. No cuts. This is a Monument to Endurance. Actually, a really cool card for Vintage. I don't think this card will see any serious play in Vintage because it doesn't do anything immediately. However, there's always people brewing in the space between Mishra's Workshop and Bazaar of Baghdad, and them being combined. And this is a perfect Workshop Bazaar card. Because with this in play, activating a Bazaar is discarding 3 cards, and you get to do all 3 things. Draw a card, create a treasure, and the opponent loses 3 life. And you can do this on every turn, too. So if you have 2 Bazaars and you had enough cards, you could go activate this on your turn, activate this on their turn. These kind of Bazaar decks typically return things like Squee, Goblin to Bob from the graveyard and have this kind of like recursion engine to offset the downside of Bazaar. This also offsets the downside of Bazaar slightly because you're going to draw a card afterwards. You're also getting to make mana off your Bazaar. So like this card does do some interesting and fun things. The problem is Bazaar Workshop decks in modern Vintage have not ever been good. And I don't think this card is going to make them good. However, I definitely recommend trying it out. The space of Bazaar Workshop decks is very fun to brew in. Lots of interesting cards with lots of interesting interactions. And I highly expect to do some amount of tapping 3 mana for artifacts and activating my Bazaar of Baghdad. Thank you for watching this Aetherdrift Voice of Vintage episode. I hope I have given you some ideas on how you can use Aetherdrift cards in your Vintage decks. And I am excited to see what Momentum Breaker, Marketback Walker, Repurposing Bay, and Grim Bauble do inside of the Vintage format. I highly suspect that some of those cards will see immediate play. This has been Justin. I'm actually level 1 for Voice of Vintage. If you want to see Vintage gameplay, make sure you check out this channel for videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.